Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Weirich. I'm the Public Diplomacy Fellow at the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications here at George Washington University. Welcome to today's webinar about public diplomacy and strategic narrative. Uh, this is the second in a series. Our overall host and MC, Associate Professor Sean Ade, can tell you more about the series as a whole. This is all based on around the Handbook for Public Diplomacy, edited by Sean. And on behalf of the IPDGC, welcome. Let's get started. Oh, and for everyone who's interested in submitting a question, please go ahead and use the Q&A function. After our conversation among the panelists, I'll read out questions in the Q&A period. With that, over to you, Sean.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Really happy to be here. This is the second of our webinars sponsored by IPDGC over here at GW. And last week we talked about national security and public diplomacy. And as Joe said, this week we're talking with a couple of the authors who did a great front piece chapter on strategic narratives for this book here, the Handbook on Public Diplomacy, that just came out from Elgar. So we're joined by Alister Miskimmon and Ben O'Loughlin. So Alister is professor of international relations at Queen's University Belfast and a fellow of the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice. And Ben is professor of international relations at Royal Holloway, University of London, and he's director of New Political Communication Unit, which was launched in 2007. Along with a couple of colleagues, Andreas Antonidis and Laura Rosell. These are the authors who have given us one of, I think, the most important theoretical innovations of the last 25 years at least, which is this concept of strategic narratives. It's a great analytical tool for thinking about public diplomacy, among other things. And their chapter talks about that, but also talks about kind of applies it to contemporary thinking around AI and other issues. One of the things that I think is really exciting about this handbook is that even though it's a reference book, and so like all reference books, the idea is to have a lot of chapters. There's more than 35 chapters in this book about different aspects of, in this case, public diplomacy that people who are doing research, students and faculty and others can use to understand, public diplomacy and all its various incarnations, historically from a research perspective. The authors also did all the authors also did an incredible job of trying to make or to write chapters that also had some sort of contemporary and even forward thinking in them, so that there is hopefully a longer shelf life to this reference book than sometimes is the case. And that is definitely what Alister and Ben have done with their chapter. So I highly recommend it. And what we're going to do here is at the outset, the two of them are going to talk about their chapter and the concept of strategic narratives generally and AI, how it applies to that. We'll have a little conversation amongst the three of us. And then, as Joe said, we'd love to open it up to some questions that you put into the Q&A part of the Zoom here, and Joe will be moderating that later. So without further ado, Alister and Ben, take it away.
Thanks very much, Sean. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm certainly delighted to be involved in the handbook. I think it's a brilliant collection of chapters on public diplomacy. So really pleased to be involved, and congratulations on bringing that all together. So yeah, the concept of strategic narrative, I thought I would just start with just to provide some context to some of the thoughts and arguments that Ben and I were making in the chapter. Um, we define strategic narratives as the following: a means for political actors to construct a shared meaning of the past, present, and future of international politics to shape the behavior of domestic and international actors. And this came about really from a number of long conversations Ben and I had a few years ago, where we were increasingly interested in how political communication and international relations weren't really talking to each other, but it was increasingly evident about the role of communication and influence and how it was evolving in that period. So strategic narrative is really the result of those conversations with between Ben and I and Andreas Antoniadis, and also importantly Laura Rosell, who co-authored two books with us. We think that narratives still remain sort of a key thing to analyze and understand in public diplomacy, and the chapter really tries to get at what innovation artificial intelligence may bring to that. Strategic narratives really operate within a media ecology, and that is in a process of constant adaptation. So actors who use strategic narratives are forced to adapt within that, and I think that's raised in the chapter. But strategic narratives, just final couple of points, are made up of two main components. One, a set of policy, identity, and order narratives. Policy narratives about policies, public policy, foreign policy of the day. Identity, what sort of actor the actor is. Is it America? Is it a great power? Or is it Ireland here, a soft, small power on the edge of Europe? And we also are very interested in dynamics of international order. And again, I think that relates to our chapter and our reflections on AI and how that has potential to disrupt order. Finally, we're also interested in sort of the processes and the dynamics of communicating strategic narratives, their formation, how polities develop them and debate them, how they're projected through this media ecology in different ways, and how that's constant flux and development. And then the really interesting aspect of reception and how the the actors you're trying to communicate receive and reflect and remix oftentimes the narratives you're trying to project. So that's the sort of the core aspects of strategic narrative that we wanted to apply to AI, and then I think AI opens up a huge range of questions that we delve into in the chapter, which Ben will outline now.
Thank you, Alister, and thank you, Joe and Sean, for the lovely introductions. And it is great to be part of this whole group and cohort of people looking at international relations, communication, and diplomacy in particular. So I'll take you through some of the like what's in the paper in quite a basic way, and then some of our main arguments, and then we can open this up to a discussion. So we start the paper, or the chapter, sorry, looking at the current perceptions of world order, which is the context for all of this, because as we've seen from the last couple of months with what US and Russia are doing, our understanding of what order is in flux. And this debate was happening already over the last 10 years because of this sense that the liberal international order was challenged, was not fully successful. We had a moment in the late 2010s when the US and China were talking about a G2. China was calling it the group of two a G2 with Chinese characteristics, which was hugely geopolitically stirring and got at how China understood the relationship between its identity and the international system. So we start the paper setting all that out because it is so in flux. There is a lot of understandings of multipolarity right now. I've attended as an AI seminar at Brookings not that long ago, where people from countries outside of the US were saying, we're not going to take US AI. We're going to have Brazilian AI or Indonesian AI or Indian AI. We saw what happened with social media. We ended up just using your stuff. That's not going to happen again. So the contestation and the sense that lots of countries think they can be quite decisive right now, be quite active, is a feature of the global order right now. We then turn to looking at how people make sense of truth claims in that order, because we've got so many debates about disinformation and various forms of malign communication. But we argue that, well, this has been around forever. People have been having different ontologies and epistemologies, if we want to keep it academic, or to put it in simpler terms, what matters differs depending on where you are, what region you're in. In the paper, we mentioned a quote from the communication scholar John Durham Peters, who was saying, well, from his perspective in writing about 2015, people seem to believe either Google or God. Where he was living in the United States, those were the two things that define what is, what matters. Whereas if you're living somewhere else, it's not Google and God, or it's a different God, or it's a different platform. And again, this goes back through human history. We've always had competing understandings of how to make sense of things and what is true. We then turn to looking at how public diplomacy actors are supposed to be projecting narratives in that very pluralistic flux order of communication and relations. And Alister's talked you through what strategic narratives are and how states, but other non-state actors as well, or international organizations, have strategic narratives. They create narratives to try to shape the behavior, shape the perceptions of others as part of the job. And then we look at what AI could be used for in public diplomacy, what it is being used a little bit for. It is certainly being used for quite mundane tasks like writing press releases or archiving data or searching. You can do a very quick content analysis of media reporting in the last 24 hours in any country in the world. It can do that for you. So basic tasks in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs could be sped up through use of AI, although how much of it is effective and has to be verified is another matter. But then also we came to the conclusion really that diplomats and strategic communication experts in world politics still have to make reasoned judgments about what is sayable and doable, especially when talking about other countries. The basic etiquette of international relations, apart from what's happening in the US, but everywhere else, it's relatively stable. And so we kind of come to the conclusion that AI isn't transforming public diplomacy from what we see so far, and I'm happy to talk more about what we see the practitioners doing. And so that means that the conventional questions in international relations and communication haven't changed. Who is doing what? Who is saying what? Who is trying to affect whom? And are they affecting whom? How do they use communication? Or how do they use other things like coercion or trade or other means of power? How do citizens experience world politics through, if they're using AI to help them? Is it giving them a different version? We don't think right now it is giving a radically different version. So we end up really with a non-radical argument, if you like, that it's not total disruption. But all you hear about AI and this kind of messianic fervor that it's transformational of everything. In the world of public diplomacy, we're not seeing that yet. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was terrific. A lot to chew on. What you just ended with there, Ben, is sort of a classic story of communication and new technology for at least 150 years, which is every time there's a new technology, there's this gee whiz period where everybody thinks that it's going to change things. Often the assumption it's going to change things for the worse, particularly for vulnerable communities like children. And we've seen this with radio and film and television and the internet and everything else. And yet the reality usually is something much less than that. It can be transformative, of course. Alister, you talked about strategic narratives existing within a media ecology, and we have to think about how different media change the way we think about effects and reception, as you said, and that's also the history of media effects research. One of the things I'm interested about what you guys wrote in your chapter is that you almost quoted verbatim there, Ben, is you say this chapter makes a simple argument despite the increasing complexities of communication that generative AI will bring, the fundamentals of public diplomacy and strategic narrative are unchanged. So there's this sort of sense of a kind of constancy to the theory and practice of public diplomacy, and that this is a tool that's being used. One of the things I want to start with then is So if we're thinking about strategic narratives in sort of in the contemporary context, when we talk about public diplomacy, we usually talk about it as compared to normal ways of thinking about strategic communication, for instance, as something that is long term in scope and in impact. And so the idea that good public diplomacy can withstand short-term policy disagreements or differences or failures. And is that true of strategic narratives, or do strategic narratives change regularly with policy or administrations, leadership, et cetera? You mentioned in passing, the United States a couple of times. Obviously, we're going through a particularly radical phase right now in a lot of different ways. But do we exaggerate that effect on strategic narratives, or is the strategic narrative of a great power or a smaller power or a non-state actor relatively constant?
Shall I jump in, Ben?
Go for
Um,
it.
yeah, really good question and a very timely question, Sean. I guess in the past we've thought about this in terms of narrative alignment across how states speak about policies and their identity narratives and then their conception of international order. And to an extent, there is, I guess, a lag on the extent to which states can become sort of strategic communicators and not have that communication and those narratives embedded in more fundamental ways within the state and within public diplomacy and diplomacy more generally. So, we've talked a lot in the past about whether narratives of states or states of narratives, and there is a sense that um, it takes a lot for radical change to occur, and there has been some sign of attempts to radically change narratives, but after their sort of initial narrative statement of change, the reality of the sort of policy implication of that sometimes is not as dramatic as the narrative itself. And we can think America, but there's also a good case in Europe in terms of Germany
Mhm.
and a conception that the war on Ukraine um, forced German foreign policy elites to go through what they call a Zeitenwende, as sort of a reassessment of German policy and a turning point. But taking that narrative statement about we need to change our policy narrative in a relationship with Russia, our relationship to defense and the use of military force, and our relationship to our allies in Europe and North and the transatlantic community. Those things were narratively changed, but the working out of that, as we're seeing, is a lot more long term. So I think there's a sense that there are sort of embedded logics and sort of expectations about how diplomatic actors speak and how they act. That even though there may be deviations from that, the 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 expectation is that there's slow adaptation over time rather than sort of critical junctures where everything changes overnight.
Mhm.
And that in the midst of quite a, um, I guess, disruptive American foreign policy environment where there have been significant changes in style and content and public diplomacy narratives that maybe is something to chew over further. But in the main, we would I think sit in the more evolutionary rather than revolutionary camp as regards to how change and narrative facilitates change in foreign policy.
Ben, do you want to add something, or?
Yeah, Germany's a great example, and with the Zeitenwende moment in 2022, and we had our moment in the UK with Brexit, where
Right.
we were supposed to have a whole new identity after that, and they hadn't worked it out. and policy hasn't really changed overall that much. So Britain tried to the US had its pivot to Asia under Obama, and it was reasonably effective. We tried that in 2021, and we haven't worked it out at all because that's not kind of our narrative, certainly not our post-colonial narrative. So our national identity was kind of constrained and bound. And so, although there was this apparently transformative moment of Brexit, our foreign policy hasn't really changed very much. And our values haven't changed much that's underpinning that identity. So, our decisions about what to do with Russia, Ukraine, or any other global crisis they wouldn't be much different than they were 10 years ago or 50 years ago.
Yeah.
We have a certain sense of our role and our values. So this does make the US a really, really interesting case right now because honestly, we've been studying this for about 15 years. And we've not seen a country make a radical narrative shift. And what seems to be happening, I mean, from what we saw with the Atlantic story yesterday, is that how foreign policy is being made is kind of I don't want to call it in chaos, but it's being done differently, and that means it's at the whim of forces that might allow a bit of creativity and disruption in the narrative they create. So usually, as Alister said, it's not just that states have narratives, but narratives capture states. Yeah. And it's quite hard to move out of your traditional narrative. But the US, this is about the first case we've seen for a very long time in world politics of possible transformation of narrative.
I think one of the interesting things that I've always gotten out of your guys' writing with your colleagues on this topic that you're touching on here is that one of the things that creates a stability to these narratives over at least an intermediate term, let's say, is culture and the role of history in culture. A country, let's take countries, for example, a country's history. And how it, if the 20th century for the United States, the 20th century and the narratives that the United States tells itself and the world about itself and about its role in the world, are a part of that narrative. So when you bring up the pivot to Asia under Obama, there's a part of me that says, yeah, but that's a change in policy priority, let's say, but it's not necessarily a change in narrative because it's based on containment, it's based on great power competition, it's based on the US's perception of its role in the world and that sort of thing. Another thing, though, about narratives, it strikes me within the context of governments, at least, or countries, let's say, is that another stabilizing factor might be bureaucracy. And that the foreign policy establishment, particularly foreign ministries, or in the US case, the State Department, usually has entrenched bureaucracies of career diplomats and other officials that create a kind of not only consistency, but also, if you will, roadblocks to radical change. One of the things that I think is really, I guess, interesting is a benign word to use, but about what's happening in the US case right now, that I think maybe we thought might happen with Brexit, but you're saying didn't really, is that the bureaucracy, if the bureaucracy is able to be altered dramatically, then maybe those roadblocks go away or some constancy goes away. Trump tried to do this in the first administration, or did it de facto because there were so many resignations. I mean, the State Department was really decimated, and we're seeing that in a much more intentional way this time. And I'm wondering if you could comment maybe on how much the consistency of a cultural or a national narrative can be damaged by or altered, let's just say altered, in a way that privileges the perspective of the chief executive in this case versus the bureaucracy? Or is that an exaggeration? Is it like what you were saying before about what happened with after Brexit? We think that now it's been 2 months of Trump. Give it time. It's all going to kind of probably be much more evolutionary than we think.
I'll start on that. My gut feeling from seeing so many cases of this through the last like 50 years of world politics is that the consistency should be there in the end. And already a lot of international leaders are saying, yeah, he says one thing, but then he doesn't do it. So we just let him work his way through as he wants to say, but then let's look at the actual policy.
Right.
That's the hope. That's the optimism. Because it was important. Like I know Biden got a lot of criticism when he picked his foreign policy staff in 2016, 2017. He brought a lot of old hands back, people who like career diplomats, if you like. But that was good for allies because they were dependable, predictable. So going back to consistency, they would be roadblocks on anything completely transformational. So that meant that there was trust could be quite stable between the US and its allies. Now, obviously, something very, very different is happening. These are not career diplomats. They're not diplomats either. So what they will do might, I still think it's going to be a burnout situation where things still have to be done. Like tax systems have to work, passports have to work. There's so much bureaucracy has to be functional for countries to function as countries. So my hope is that things don't move too much. But Alistair might be more pessimistic. I don't know.
No, it's an excellent question, and Sean, I think it reminds me, thinking back to sort of the early 1990s work of James Fearon and his work on government type and foreign policy positions. And essentially, he made the argument that you had a lot more consistency in a democratic system and dealing with more centralized styles of government. That created these imbalances and uncertainty, and especially around how consistent an actor may be in any foreign policy situation. And it was interesting, Fiona Hill was talking about this in relation to, I guess, negotiations around Ukraine and the relationship between the US and Russia, whereas it seems that Putin, over several decades now, has established a bureaucracy that is built around him and to sustain the power. And as Ben was talking about, I think the Trump administration um, is more ad hoc and maybe revolutionary in the way that it's seeking to eke out different positions. I think different countries also have different models of foreign service or the level of political appointees within any state, and more established, I guess, civil service, an embedded civil service bureaucracy in a country like the UK is probably going to result in, the long game playing out a lot more consistently and maybe less fundamental narrative shifts between different government administrations. So it brings in a lot of questions about government type and how foreign policy and diplomacy is structured and organized, and certainly what's happening in the US maybe has the potential to radically shift positions if it becomes embedded as a way of doing foreign policy in a direction that we're seeing. Um, I guess the other important thing is it's culture, Sean. I think it's also memory
Mhm.
as a really important factor in both the sort of professional circles of foreign policy and diplomacy and a civil service bureaucracy. But I think, and that's sort of held within the institutions of government in many states. But I think that more broadly speaking, in the population, who are your friends and allies, is something that is often connected, certainly in the transatlantic space, to former conflicts where people fought side by side. And I think for those things to, I guess, be reinterpreted in different circumstances, those memories are pretty embedded. And so I think there's a narrative shock when uh, an ally talks about the world and relationships in different ways.
Mhm. I think, one of the things you guys brought up today and in the chapter is about reception. I think by extension, that involves audiences and public opinion. And just to what you were just saying, Alister, I think to people of our generation, it's very odd to see an American leader so fawning over Russia and in a conflict situation or any situation. And yet, what we see in public opinion polling in the United States is that younger, especially younger partisans, but even younger people that aren't really necessarily paying. By younger, I just mean, but under 35 or something. Um, don't have the same sort of memory as you're saying about Russia as the Soviet Union or that kind of conflict, great power conflict. And so there's this opening there for a change in direction that is, to my mind, very problematic, but is also, it's an interesting test case of what you're talking about. I want to bring up before we go to questions, I want to bring up what you talked about AI. Last week, James Pammon, who I know you both know very well, in his chapter with a couple of colleagues of his, they talk about Nick Cull's idea of reputational security and about how public diplomacy can often be defensive in contemporary practice. And I'm wondering with AI and its relationship, its use in public diplomacy. Um, I know you're arguing that it's not as radical as people fear, especially. But I'm wondering about the sort of source queue misinformation aspect of AI that people worry about. How, as particularly in the Russian case, but how does your argument about AI play out in a way that makes us think about competing narratives, and particularly when we can't necessarily trust who's telling us what they're telling us? I mean, is that something we don't need to worry about with strategic narratives because by definition they're coming from an official source, or if we can't trust it, but I know in the American case, and we're not alone, I know it's true in many places in Europe at a minimum, not trusting official sources is kind of part of, well, of course, it's part of the Russian game plan to begin with. So I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Ben, do you want to kick off?
Yeah. So um, I'm examining a PhD next week about this, where this student is comparing how political parties in India and the UK use digital tools. And the student is finding that in India in particular, the BJP and also the opposition INC both employ as trusted volunteers 1 million people in what they call their political army to spread disinformation about the other and to big up our own party. And this has been happening for a long time. And this is just the picture I take from that is this is just politics. You try and win the argument, you try and belittle the other and make yourself look strong. And like, I don't want to sound like a complete realist, but this is what we're going to see happening with AI is most countries will try to promote their country's version of AI. They will try and belittle or regulate the hell out of any international competition on AI. And so we're in this world where we don't really trust each other very much. And it is normatively, morally not great. It's not a great picture of world politics, but that seems to be where we are. Like most countries are trying this. And of course they're trying it because they want to get whatever advantage out of AI they can. That means we can't quite trust what each other's saying about AI or their policies in general. But we borrow a term in the chapter, Alister and I, from The Economist in 2023. They talked about we're in an order of mercenary multipolarity.
Mhm.
And that mercenariness seems quite accurate. Like we are, yes, we care, each state still cares about its reputational security, but it is also extremely competitive right now. So I'm I'm expecting more mercenary multipolarity through 2025 at least.
Alistair, do you have anything to add or?
Yeah, I guess it a bit like Ben was saying, it's accepting the situation and expecting our politics and our, I guess, the way we communicate to respond to the new development in the ecology. And the digital natives and the people that are growing up that maybe don't have that sort of historical memory of geopolitical rivalry and things like that you were alluding to, Sean. And I fully agree with you on that. It's really interesting teaching European international relations to first year students here. I feel that I'm unlocking secrets of a past they never knew at times. Um, so I think there definitely will be more competition. But I guess it sort of goes back to that previous point about narrative still being sort of a key component of how we communicate and make sense of the world, and where public diplomacy professionals, government officials, and concerned citizens can sustain those narratives going forward to make sense of the world and how the world will continue to evolve. I think that's where we can, I guess, maintain a sort of a degree of shared understanding of national and international issues. Um, so I think from that perspective, that gives me some way to, I guess, make sense that we're not going to have just revolutionary change because of AI. Um, the interesting thing is that there's not really new conceptions of what order may look like. I think Ben and I have thought about this and talked about this a lot. I think it's just more competition, more voices, more demands to be recognized. But when you ask and you look for sort of new models or narratives for how we order our international system, they're not as many as you might expect with these new voices and new ideas coming to the fore. So there is often sort of a shared sense of narrative about the world, and it sort of centers more on that competitive spirit that Ben's talking about, um, and a piece of the pie or a piece of the action or a recognition. Um, and I guess where reputation may come in then is, I think, for emerging powers and emerging players, non-state and state actors, demanding that recognition and the reputation that comes with it in terms of being a major player in some of the sort of order shifting developments that we'll see is probably where I see that narrative contestation and recognition and non-recognition happening.
Yes. Joe, you're a senior foreign service officer. I have either questions from the chat or any of your own for um, Ben and Alister.
I'll save my own if we indeed have time. But first, let's get to one from the chat. Um, so for the panel, one participant asks, uh, how do the closures of Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and other USAGM funded media outlets affect U.S. public diplomacy and the trust of U.S. allies in America in defending democracy?
I mean, this is how you tell your story. If you're American, we're basically saying we're muting our ability to tell our story. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah,
Oh,
and off the back, I don't understand the logic. It might save some money, but I would, even if the interests and the narratives are changing in the American context, I think influence is still sort of in the DNA of any administration to push globally. And I think these were, yeah, interesting vehicles. I see. I think is it Czechia is offering to host Radio Free Europe potentially, and that's you know there is a live discussion about who is the guardian of the West and Western ideals and values now. So it might be interesting that some of these ideals that many Americans hold are expressed um, by others as well, in different ways and new ways as the media ecology evolves. But yeah, I scratch my head on that one too, Sean.
Okay.
yeah. we've done a lot of work at Royal Holloway with BBC World Service, and they are scratching their heads at what's going on. Because on the one hand, it's a bigger slice of the pie for us. Like we can get the audiences through radio and whatever channels, but we're losing an eye with similar values traditionally. And so we're not going to be pushing the same messages because we do push some quite similar narratives, the US and UK. And if the US isn't showing up now, if it's turning their own voice off, then what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to ally with others? It also means that it has generational effects. Like you know this better than anybody. The kind of soft power benefits that you get from VOA or we get from BBC World Service stretch over generations because people grow up in households that are listening to these things or watching these things, and it's just normal for them, and then they pass it on to their children. And to cut that off is, as Alister says, there is not a strong logic to it. Um, and it's, before handing back to you, Alister, it's handing a slice of the pie to everyone else. This is
Yeah.
why China is up and like cheering about what's happened because it makes it so much easier for China now.
Yeah.
So, Alister.
Yeah, no, I think it does link into soft power, and um, America is not alone in this sort of cutting of what we saw as really good amplifiers of values of democracy and influence. There is a struggle, despite the creation of a soft power council in the United Kingdom, a struggle to, fund some of these soft power capabilities. Ben and I recently submitted evidence to a soft power committee in the House of Commons, really stressing the need for these as as really core to soft power influence activities from the UK's perspective. So it is. I mean, you look at aid policy and aid spending, a thing that has been cut in the US and the UK recently. And again, that links to, well, who can fill the void of that? Who can provide aid across the world to support communities? And it will be China and other actors, and they will get the benefit. So it is, if the world is all about influence and for good and ill, these are the sorts of things that I would advise governments to maintain as core to those objectives and those goals rather than cutting them.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things real briefly to that, which is that, first of all, historically, the tug of war with international broadcasting in just about any major country, at least, that does this, that is involved in this, isn't between yes or no, it's between the type. And so, are you allowing your international broadcasting, take Voice of America as an example, to be something like objective journalism with standards consistent with that practice, like the BBC or anything like that? Or, this has usually historically been the tension, or is it going to be more propagandistic? And in the US case, it's true in most countries that do this, that has, been a tug of war for decades. In the first Trump administration, they had a director named Peck who basically wanted to turn it into a propaganda organ. And there is this philosophy that is not new to the Trump administration um, that U.S. public international broadcasting should, not be engaging in any reporting that could potentially reflect negatively on the United States, which is, of course, completely ahistorical. As you know, to get to Alister's point about memory, historical memory, and just basically historical knowledge, to understand what was important about Radio Free Europe and Voice of America and Radio Marti and these types of programs was precisely because when you're broadcasting into, let's say, the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, and your contrast with state-run media is that they can hear you talk about news that is not necessarily complimentary. And that alone is a public diplomacy win. It's promoting your values of freedom. And so that has historically been the challenge is getting people to understand that it shouldn't be propaganda. This is completely new. This is like, let's just get rid of it, which makes no sense whatsoever in terms of national security and telling your story and all that. The other thing I would add is something that I think Ben was hinting at or alluding to, which is there's another value to programs, especially the BBC, most importantly, which is as a model for journalism around the world, particularly in places that don't have a free press and independent press. And, I think the most important example of the influence of these types of programs, and especially BBC, is Al Jazeera, which is formed on the basis of the BBC model. This is the story they tell about their origin story and all that. And Al Jazeera is a very complicated history, but that's one of the values of a Voice of America program or BBC, et cetera, is training journalists, developing independent media, creating a model for this type of accountability. And that's also going to be lost with this as well. Yeah, I think the point you just made about it being a generational problem is really, really apt. Joe, anything else?
Yeah, another question about AI's impact on shared memory, on shared sort of national narrative. Just the questioner is asking for the panelists to maybe expand a bit on how they expect the uptake of artificial intelligence to uh, uh, to accelerate change, mis and disinformation efforts that aim to corrode and undermine shared national memory, shared understanding of the past.
So on that, we've just been discussing that in a seminar with my undergraduate. So this is really, thank you for that question, Michael. And my students were saying countries are going to be doing this anyway. They did it before AI disinformation. They'll do it now that we've got AI. They'll do it on a bigger scale now. They might try and use AI to chart and map the disinformation coming from other actors in other countries. So it can be an intelligence tool as well, and maybe use that to disrupt what the other countries are doing while we try and do the same ourselves. But they were really, the students were saying that it's media literacy that and AI literacy that is what for them is the most significant thing, because they see their friends get sucked into disinformation holes. Or they were saying, it was quite funny, they were saying, no, it's my uncles and aunties. During COVID, they went onto these Facebook groups because they were lonely. And now they just believe, stuff that you can't reason with them. And so they were saying we need this AI literacy to be taught to children from age 8 onwards, but also taught to older generations because they're still going to be using it a bit. So there was a big sense that since states and non-state actors are going to be using AI to scale up their disinformation campaigns, that this is where it's not just the projection, but the reception matters. Those of us, all citizens are going to be receiving this stuff. We need to be able to interpret it, break it down, unpack it, and make an understanding for ourselves about what the content is that is reaching us. But that is hard, and it costs money. Training people and teaching school children about data literacy is difficult.
Alister? Hope you're muted, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was reflecting on Ben's comments. I was thinking about my own experience with students, and one of the things, I guess, AI is doing a number of things in different areas of our life. There is I guess, the technical development, the sort of what formula give me a formula for an Excel spreadsheet to sort data, and Copilot or another provider will be able to give you that without you having to think about it, and it's a tool in order to do your job. I think the space of history and politics is so much more complex, and that's where I guess the media literacy is needed. I think primarily is if people view AI as sort of the source of an answer in our politics and our history, that's where it gets, for me, more dangerous, in the sense of typing into OpenAI, um, you know, why did the American Civil War happen? Or, you know, a student in an MA class today typed in, should America have invaded Iraq? And the answer came back, no. But I then pressed her to say, well, maybe you should investigate why it gave you that answer a bit more. And I think that's sort of where it gets into a complicated media literacy conversation that is time consuming. People may not have the wherewithal, time, inclination to dig deep into sort of historical or political complexity in the way that we have the luxury to do in our careers and our environments. So I think it will be an ongoing thing. I think we're already in, as Ben alluded to, we're already in a space where it's still incumbent upon us all, even at this stage before AI has developed further, to reinforce some historical knowledge in our discussions. And I guess my only silver lining is that the amount of historical programming on British TV is still very high. So, and um, the history sections in bookshops in the UK, I think, are really still very popular. So there is a massive appetite out there, both to come and study it and to read about it, and maybe that gives us some hope.
Well, that is not true in the United States, but one can dream. Anything else, Joe?
So nothing else in the chat. If those who've dialed in do have a question, please put a question in there. But I have one
Please.
for our panel. So we've talked about a manifestly negative potential in AI and in the form of disinformation. I'm interested in how you see the downstream effects of what we could all agree is a wonderful potential upside of AI, but one that can potentially have negative implications for the United States and the UK in the practice of public diplomacy, and that is uh, the ever advancing use of AI as a real-time interpreter translator device, making it more and more easy uh, for there to be conversations that happen between two people who do not share a common language. The United States, the UK, and other countries that speak English have, since the end of the Second World War, derived soft power benefit just in sort of untold value um, from being native speakers of the language of international commerce, of international science, of international aviation, and so on. We take it as given that English is the language spoken by elites in almost every country around the world, and those who aspire to elite status internationally. So, what does it mean if we enter a world where speaking English is no longer a requirement to arrive at the international elite in any given field?
So I'll go first with this one. It's a dilemma for our countries then, as you're framing it, because we gain all of these commercial and other benefits from English being the elite language for most transactions that are important to us, versus if AI can auto-translate any language at any time, then we can enter a more pluralistic, inclusive world order where we can actually have a proper conversation. Like I know a lot of scholars have noticed that a lot of Chinese academics can speak English so they can understand what's happening in the United States, whereas not many US professors can speak Chinese traditional or any form. And so US intelligence of China or just US-China societal relations are not what they could be, but this could transform. So, like, we work with cultural relations institutes like Goethe Institute or some of the State Department, the British Council. they spend so much effort translating stuff so that they can have inclusive events in Mumbai or in Moscow or wherever is the target audience this week. And this AI could be transformative of that. It could make it really low cost, and so more people can organize events, more people can organize exchanges. Um, it could be a diplomatic good thing as long as you trust the technology. Um, so I'll go with the optimism on this one. Could be good.
Alister?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that enables um, more widespread global understanding across major issues um, through language is always going to be a good thing. I mean, you think of that potential for discussions that are often difficult around climate um, and other protracted global issues. So I think the upside is definitely that. I think we're already far beyond a stage in the world where there's more second speakers of English than native speakers. So I guess we've been navigating that for some time. I think in the there's two things that jumped out though from your great question, Joe. Um, One is the sort of the culture around language and communication and how certainly in diplomacy there are examples of missteps in language that have caused difficulties in diplomacy. Um, the other thing in terms of I guess, the attractiveness of the language that you were alluding to, Joe, is maybe what is done with language. I'm from Ireland, so we have Seamus Heaney and poetry, and that has been a big selling point for our sort of cultural soft power in the world. And I think so. Language as uh, something that produces a cultural uh, um, attractiveness is also something which I think might be something that would suggest that English will still retain a very positive place in soft power and global discussions. But it is I think the democratization and the widening potential of AI is the biggest thing for me, and I think that would be transformative. Um, Mostly, hopefully, in good ways in terms of understanding, but obviously there is scope for things to go bad, as you intimate.
Well, that's a reasonably optimistic note to end on. So I appreciate that these days. I want to thank Alister and Ben for joining us and for writing a wonderful chapter. And I want to remind everyone that this is the second of four of these webinars that we'll be doing. Join us next Tuesday, April 1st at 10 a.m. Washington, D.C. time, when another one of our practitioner authors, former Senior Foreign Service Officer and former U.S. Charge d'Affaires in Paris, Mark Taplin, will join me to talk about the centrality of public diplomacy and foreign relations and some of the contemporary issues and challenges that we're facing today around the world. Um, and then finally, I'm going to talk to another author of a great chapter in this book, Kendra Salois from American University at 11 a.m. Washington time on April 22nd in the last of our webinar series about her chapter on hip hop, music, and cultural diplomacy. Thanks again to Joe and to the great folks at the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the director, Babak Bahadur, Rocio helped us put on the Zoom today, Dabani, and everybody else that's sort of been a part of this process behind the scenes. And thanks, guys, for a great conversation. Look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. And thanks again. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.